Hi, sweetheart. Don't forget our anniversary today. The message played by itself. George froze. That was his voice, his tone, his rhythm, soft and slow, like it always was when he spoke to his late wife. But he hadn't recorded that, not ever. He stared at the old phone lying on the kitchen counter, its little red light blinking a single voicemail waiting to be played again. Outside, the California afternoon was silent, and the clock over the sink ticked like it was mocking him. He pressed replay. Hi, sweetheart. Don't forget our anniversary today. Same warmth, same tremor, the same man who'd buried his wife 2 years ago. But there was no anniversary left to remember. George swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he opened the yellow envelope sitting beside the phone. The letterhead said, County Clerk's Office, Riverside County. Inside was a crisp sheet of paper embossed with a golden seal. At the top, bold type read, Marriage Certificate, George Miller and Melissa Miller. He blinked twice. Melissa Miller, his daughter-in-law. He whispered, barely breathing, This has to be a mistake. The next morning, he drove to the county clerk's office holding the certificate like something that might explode. A young clerk looked up from her computer and smiled politely. Can I help you, sir? Yeah, he said. I got this in the mail. It says I'm married to my daughter-in-law. She typed his name, frowned, then turned the monitor so he could see. His name. His ID number. His signature. Her signature. All verified, sir. She said gently, It's official. You're legally married. And for the first time in his life, George Miller forgot how to breathe. He wasn't just confused, he was scared. Because if something like this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. If you've ever trusted someone with your name, your papers, or your voice, stay with this story. You might hear something that sounds a little too familiar. George Miller was 78 when the house stopped sounding like home. 2 years had passed since his wife Mary was gone, and yet her presence lingered in every quiet corner, the scent of her lavender soap. The creak of the hallway floor. She used to hate the coffee mug she'd chipped and refused to throw away. He still made coffee for two. Habit was the only companion that hadn't left. Outside Riverside was the same California sun he'd known for 40 years, but the light seemed crueler now. Neighbors waved, less conversations died faster. No one knew what to say to a widower. George filled his days with routine morning news pills in a plastic box, small repairs he didn't really need to do. He'd worked as a mechanic all his life, a man of bolts, engines, and things that made sense, paperwork, computers, online accounts. That was Mary's territory. Without her, even opening an email felt like climbing a mountain. Then came Daniel and Melissa. Daniel was his only son, 45, once confident, now restless, a salesman who'd lost his job when the company downsized. He spoke faster these days, laughed less, drank more. Melissa, on the other hand, was calm. She worked part-time as a nurse at the community clinic. Gentle hands, steady voice, the kind of woman people trusted instantly. At Mary's funeral, she was the one who stood beside George long after everyone else had gone. When Daniel disappeared to take phone calls, Melissa stayed. She held the old man's arm and said softly, Don't worry, Dad. I'll take care of your meds, your paperwork, everything. He believed her, not because he was naive, but because she said it the same way Mary used to. Soon Melissa began visiting twice a week, then every day. She cleaned the kitchen, organized his bills, refilled prescriptions online. She even helped him navigate Medicare forms, long paragraphs, digital boxes, passwords that never worked. Just tap here, Dad. I'll handle the rest, she'd say. He tapped. He trusted. He didn't read. Daniel noticed. You trust her more than me, he said one night, half drunk, half jealous. George sighed. At least she shows up. Those words hung between them like smoke, quiet, dangerous, impossible to take back. Melissa said nothing when Daniel slammed the door. She just smiled and turned back to the laptop. Families fight, she whispered. It's what makes us real. The next day she came back with a small folder. I saved copies of your ID, your insurance, and your signature. Makes things easier next time. George nodded, grateful. No one had offered to make his life easier in a long time. In the months that followed, she became the heartbeat of his house. She brought groceries, reminded him about appointments, even set up automatic payments for utilities. To anyone looking in, she was the perfect daughter-in-law. To George, she was proof that kindness hadn't died with Mary. Still, every night he talked to his wife's picture. "You'd like her," he'd whisper. "She's thoughtful, practical." Sometimes he swore the picture frowned back. On a gray November morning, Melissa arrived with a tablet in hand. "It's another Medicare update," she said. "They just need you to confirm consent." He looked at the screen, endless paragraphs of legal text. "Do I need to read all that?" "No, it's just routine. Click yes and sign at the bottom." He did. His digital signature looped perfectly under the line. Melissa smiled, clicked save, and the tablet flashed a message: "Authorized signature saved for future use." George didn't notice. He was busy thanking her for bringing warm soup. Later that evening, he sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. A light breeze slipped through the open curtain and brushed across his face. For the first time in months, he didn't feel lonely. He felt safe, because someone cared enough to show up. He didn't know it yet, but sometimes the kindest hands are the ones that move the quietest. Trust, he'd say years later, isn't something you give. It's something you lose quietly. He used to believe money troubles were storms you could drive through if you kept both hands on the wheel. Daniel had learned that from his father. But somewhere between the pink slips and the promises of quick returns, the road disappeared. He tried to fix it the way salesmen fix everything with confidence in a credit card. Then, crypto came along like a bright door in a dark hallway. "Just a few months," he told Melissa. "We'll double it, maybe triple it, and I'll get us out." The door slammed shut with $70,000 on the wrong side. Bills piled, calls came. Daniel stopped sleeping. He chewed on shame like it was gum he couldn't spit out. Melissa did not panic. She organized. She color-coded debt with sticky notes, built a spreadsheet, and watched Daniel drown one quiet week at a time. "Look at me," she said one night, lifting his chin with two fingers. "You don't have to lose everything. We still have your father." Daniel flinched. "Don't say it like that." "Like what? Like he's a bank." "He's a roof," she said. "A roof with equity. A roof that keeps the rain off our heads." She let the words soften. "And you know he trusts me." Daniel rubbed his face. "He trusts you because you show up." "Then let me show up," she answered. The plan did not arrive as a crime. It arrived as a definition of family. "If I were his legal spouse," Melissa said slowly, tasting each word, "we could shift the house for a while. Keep it safe from liens. It stays in the family either way." Daniel stared at her. "You can't be serious. It's paperwork," she said. "Paperwork protects. We won't tell him because we won't need to. It's for him, for us." "That's—" He couldn't finish the sentence without choosing the word wrong. Instead, he chose silence. "Temporary. Temporary," she promised. "Until we breathe again." He wanted to believe that the way he'd wanted to believe the market only goes up. Wanting is a powerful drug. Melissa began to collect what trust had already given her. In a drawer by the sink, photocopies of George's driver's license and his Medicare card. In a password vault, she managed the login to the patient portal that stored his digital forms. In the voicemail archive, the gentle cadence of his voice, years of "Call me when you get home, son and Mary, I'm picking up bread." She learned the way a good nurse learns a chart: quietly, carefully, completely. At the kitchen table, she opened her laptop. Daniel watched over her shoulder, complicit by proximity. She didn't need much: a county website, an application that asked ordinary questions, and the confidence to behave as if nothing about this was extraordinary at all. "Marriage license filing," she murmured, reading aloud, so Daniel would hear the words and get used to them. "Name of groom, George Miller. Name of bride, Melissa Miller." She paused. "That last name will make it look normal." "Normal," Daniel repeated, as if the word could bless the act. She pulled up George's saved e-signature from a recent Medicare consent, the loop of the G, the settled weight of the M practice baked into curve and pressure. "He signs the same way every time," she said. "It's almost like a stamp." "That signature's for doctors," Daniel said. "Doctors, clerks, systems, they're all just doors. You knock with a name and a signature." The voice was harder. "We still need him to say something," she added. "Some counties record the ceremony." Daniel swallowed. "And how will he do that?" Melissa scrolled to a folder labeled Dad Voicemails. She pressed play on one. George's voice filled the room, warm, patient, weary. She opened a browser tab to a site Daniel had never heard of and uploaded the file. "What is that?" he asked. Software that learns a voice, she said. It mimics tone, rhythm, breath. Give it 10 minutes and it can make you say anything. Anything. She clicked a test line, a George Miller take. Melissa Miller is my wife. Daniel pushed back his chair. Turn it off. We won't need much, she said gently. Just a sentence. Just enough for a clerk who hates his job and wants to go to lunch. They were not monsters, not yet. Monsters announced themselves. These were just two people moving a line 1 inch at a time, one justification at a time, until the map said they were somewhere else entirely. The day of the filing, Melissa did not wear white. She wore gray. Daniel wore gilt. They met a man in a cheap suit outside the county building. He was older than George by a decade and smelled like aftershave and peppermint. In a brown paper bag, he carried the face that would make the paperwork true, a silicone mask detailed down to the little sunspots along the cheekbone. Daniel gagged when the man pulled it on. Jesus. It's theater, the man said through stiff lips. Community shows do better than you think. He blinked until the mask settled. How do I look like my father if he stopped sleeping and started lying? Daniel whispered. Inside, the fluorescent lights flattened everyone into boredom. The clerk behind the glass had a stack of forms and a clock with a loud second hand. Next, the clerk said without looking up. Melissa smiled. Marriage license filing. Names were said. IDs were slid forward. A witness signature was offered with a shaking hand. When the clerk asked for a verbal record, Melissa placed her phone on the counter screen bright. She hit play. George's voice, a careful private thing, came out into public air. I, George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife. The clerk did not flinch. He checked a box. The man in the mask signed George's name the way Melissa had practiced with him, curve by curve. The G found its loop and the M settled into its weight. The clerk stamped the page with the kind of finality only ink can provide. That's it, Daniel asked. Voice small. That's it, the clerk said. You'll receive confirmation by mail. They stepped back into the daylight. It should have felt like a wedding. It felt like being buried standing up. Daniel leaned against the wall, breathing hard. It was supposed to be a joke. It was supposed to be nothing. Melissa put a hand on his chest. His heart raced under her palm. It's protection, she said. That's all. 1 week, she promised, and we'll have space to fix this. 1 week and we'll move the house. Then we tell him. Then we undo it. Promises are bridges built from fog. You can step onto them. You cannot cross. The letter arrived on a Thursday. A gold seal. A code in the corner that matched what the website said it would. Approved. Filed. Recorded. Daniel read it twice and felt something in his ribs split open. It's still him, he said weakly. It's still family. Melissa's eyes cooled the way water does when the sun leaves. Family doesn't mean truth, Daniel, she said. It means survival. He looked at her like he was seeing the shore disappear. What if he finds out? She slipped the certificate back into the envelope and sealed it with her thumb. Then we say we did it for him. And if that's not true, she kissed his forehead like a nurse does a child. Then we make it true. That was the day a plan stopped being a plan. That was the day a lie became law. The letter came in a plain white envelope stamped County Clerk's Office, Riverside County. George thought it was another tax reminder, another notice about something he didn't owe. He slid it open with a butter knife, careful old habits dying slow. Inside was a single page, thick paper, a gold seal. At the top, marriage certificate, George Miller and Melissa Miller. He read it once, then again. The date on the certificate matched the same week he'd gone for a doctor's appointment 40 miles away. Someone had written his name in perfect cursive. Someone had signed for him. That's not me, he whispered. He folded the paper, unfolded it, folded it again. The air in the room felt thinner. When he reached the county clerk's office, the fluorescent lights hummed like flies. The clerk, a young woman with neat hair and a polite smile, took the certificate and typed something into her computer. Sir, this is a confirmed record. Filed and verified. Verified, he said. By who your witness was, Daniel Miller, she replied. Your son. George froze. My son. She turned the monitor toward him. There was his photo, him in a dark suit standing beside Melissa, his ID number, his digital signature. A small video still showed him holding her hand. That's not me, he said again, louder this time. Sir, she said softly, the record is sealed and complete. There's nothing to dispute unless you file for annulment. He stared at the monitor. The man in the picture smiled the same half-smile he did in old family photos. It was uncanny, perfect wrong. He left the office without remembering how. At home, he sat in the kitchen where Mary's picture hung. The walls seemed closer. His breath felt like a noise that didn't belong. The phone rang. Daniel. Dad. You got the mail. You knew. She said it was for protection. She said, "Don't you dare use that word." He slammed the paper on the table, the gold seal catching the light like something mocking him. You watched her marry your own father. Daniel's voice broke through the receiver. It wasn't like that. It was paperwork. She said it wouldn't count, just to protect the house. You think this is about a house, George shouted. It's about my name, my wife's name. There was a pause, a silence that split into breathing and guilt. Dad, I thought I was helping. We were drowning. You sold me, George said quietly, to save yourself. Daniel said nothing. On the other end, only the faint sound of a woman's voice, Melissa whispering something George couldn't make out. He hung up. That night, headlights cut across the living room window. Melissa's car. She walked up the path in her nurse's scrubs carrying a casserole dish like nothing had happened. George opened the door before she could knock. Don't you dare come in here. I just brought dinner. You brought hell. Melissa kept her voice calm, professional, the way nurses talk to patients who don't understand. You're confused, George. You signed the consent forms yourself. The hell I did. Memory slips happen. It's normal at your age. You think I'm senile? She sighed. I think you're scared. And when people are scared, they blame the ones still trying to help. He stepped closer. You used my name. You used my son. You used my wife's house. For a split second, her composure cracked, then returned. If you report it, you'll lose everything. The court will freeze your assets. They already have. What are you talking about? She pulled a folded paper from her bag and placed it on the table. Temporary restraining order. Shared marital property. Until the investigation clears, she said. You can't sell or transfer anything. It's just procedure. Shared marital. He stopped. The words hit harder than a slap. She smiled, faint and tired. We're legally married, George. I'm just protecting what's ours. Ours, Daniel's too. We're family. He could smell her perfume, faint vanilla, the same scent she wore when she used to help him take his pills. Now it made him sick. Get out, he said. You'll thank me one day. Get out. She left quietly, closing the door like a nurse leaving a patient's room after bad news. The next morning, the mail slot clattered again. Another envelope, this time from the county court. George opened it with numb fingers. Restraining order enforced. Subject George Miller. Below in small print, pending investigation of potential elder mismanagement. He read it 3 times before realizing what it meant. He couldn't touch his own bank account, couldn't sell his own house, couldn't even change his will. Outside, the neighbor, Mrs. Torres, waved politely. He waved back, pretending nothing was wrong. But the way she looked at him, half pity, half gossip, told him she'd already heard something. He stepped back inside and locked the door. That night, the phone rang again. Melissa's voice calm as ever. George, I know you're angry, but this is for your protection. You'll see that soon. He said nothing. People talk, she continued. They'll say things. I just want to make sure you're safe, that no one takes advantage of you. He hung up. Then he sat in the dark, the certificate on the table before him. The gold seal glinted under the lamp proof of a life he never lived, a marriage he never made. He whispered more to himself than to anyone. They took my name before they took my home. And in that single sentence, he understood what helplessness really sounded like. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Someone from the county leaked the record to a local blog. By noon, it was everywhere. Elderly man accidentally marries his daughter-in-law in online filing. The photo they used wasn't even real, just a blurred frame from the forged video. George sat in his living room, the TV, muttering his own name like it belonged to someone else. Neighbors stared longer when he walked to get the mail. One of them, Mr. Klein, gave a polite nod that said, I know and I wish I didn't. Others just whispered. By the end of the week, even the cashier at the grocery store gave him a look of pity. You're that man, aren't you? From the news, he didn't answer. He just left his cart and walked home. He tried calling Daniel, but the number was disconnected. Melissa's voicemail had changed. You've reached the Miller residence. Leave a message for us. That one word "us" was enough to make his stomach turn. The mailbox filled with letters he didn't open, official envelopes, community newsletters, one from a local church titled Forgiveness and Family. Forgiveness. They wrote as if he had sinned. On the seventh day after the story broke, someone spray-painted the words, "Old Fool," on his garage door. He scrubbed until his hands shook. The paint didn't come off. He stopped leaving the house. He unplugged the TV. He ate from cans and spoke to no one. Then one morning a brochure slid under his door, legal aid for seniors, free consultations. He almost threw it away. Then he saw a line printed in small blue text, "Elder financial abuse is a crime." He called the number. A woman answered, "Sarah Keene Legal Aid Office." Her voice was steady, low, professional, not the tone people used when they pitied him. He hesitated, then said, "I think someone made me marry them." There was a pause. Then, "Can you come in today, Mr. Miller?" The office smelled like coffee and paper. Sarah was younger than he expected, maybe 30, 32. She didn't look shocked when he told her everything. She just listened, typing notes. When he finished, she asked, "Do you have the certificate?" He handed her the gold-sealed document, folded and soft from too many times in his hands. She examined it, then turned her monitor so he could see. "This signature? It matches perfectly." "Because it's mine," he said, "but I didn't sign that. You used digital forms before, right?" He nodded. "Someone could have reused your saved signature." She clicked open a forensic comparison tool. 2 signatures overlapped, identical. Sarah frowned. 99% match. That's not imitation, that's duplication. Then she asked, "Did you ever record your voice for any system? Medical banking, I used voicemail. My daughter-in-law handled my calls sometimes." Sarah opened a small speaker app and said, "Listen to this." A file played. "I, George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife." The words were perfect. The tone, breath, and tremble were his, but he had never said them. He covered his face with both hands. "That's my voice," he said, "but I never said those words." Sarah let the silence stay. Then she said, "It's AI software, Mr. Miller. It can mimic tone, breath, even hesitation. You can buy it online for $50. He stared at her. "You mean a computer made me say that? A person used a computer to make you say that? And that person probably has everything: your signature, your ID, your trust." She began to dig deeper. Logins, email traces, payment histories. A transaction led to a voice generation website registered under an alias, M Medical Solutions. Melissa Miller. Sarah murmured. They both knew. Over the next week, Sarah filed an injunction to freeze the fraudulent marriage record. She guided George through statements, notarized forms, and endless paperwork. Each time she saw his hands tremble, she slowed down. When he asked, "Will anyone believe me?" she said, "They will when they hear how precise the lie is." A few days later, they sat in her office again. Sarah had the evidence on a screen: timestamps, metadata, and financial trails. "This isn't just identity theft," she said. "It's digital forgery with intent to defraud. It's a felony." George looked out the window. "All I wanted was peace after my wife." "You will have it again," she said softly. "But first we have to make them answer for this." She leaned forward. "We'll take this to the district attorney. But we need proof beyond the digital, something human. A pattern, a witness." "My son," he said quietly. "He was there." Sarah nodded. "Then we start with him." That night, George listened to the fake voice file again. He needed to understand it to hear where the lie began. Every breath was familiar. Every word was alien. He whispered along, matching his tone. "I, George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife." Then he stopped. He couldn't. Tears fell on the table, blurring the ink of the letter beside it. "That's my voice," he whispered, "but it's not me." The recording kept playing after he stopped listening until it ended with static. In that static, he heard something else, a faint click, a background noise like a second recording starting. Sarah would later call it a splice marker. At that moment, it just sounded like the heartbeat of something not yet over. He shut the file. He picked up the marriage certificate, folded it once more, and said to no one, "If this voice could steal a man's life, how many lives were already stolen?" And for the first time since it began, he felt not just broken, but angry. The rain had followed him home from the courthouse, a slow drizzle tapping on the gutters, whispering against the window panes. George moved through the house like a shadow, turning off lights one by one until only the lamp above the kitchen table glowed. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to relief. Sarah believed him. There were files, evidence, things that could finally make sense. He poured a glass of water, sat down, and stared at the Gold County seal still stamped on the corner of a photocopy. Tomorrow he thought they'd send it to the district attorney. Tomorrow someone would listen. He woke at 2:14 a.m. A sound had threaded through the rain, soft, deliberate, not the wind, not the pipes. It came again, click, then a shuffle, downstairs. He sat up in bed, heartbeat climbing like a drum under the floorboards. "Who's there?" he called. The house swallowed the words. Another click, a door hinge. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. The beam cut a pale line through the hallway. "Hello," he said again, voice rough, half threat, half prayer. No answer. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain. Downstairs, the air felt colder. He could smell wet earth. Someone had tracked mud onto the rug by the door. His eyes went straight to the table. The folder was open. The copy of the marriage certificate, the one Sarah had marked in red ink, was gone. In its place lay another document, neat and official, still warm from a printer. Divorce certificate, George Miller and Melissa Miller, filed and signed, filed by George Miller's self-petition. He picked it up, fingers shaking, his signature looped across the bottom, perfect, practiced identical to the one he hadn't written. He whispered, "No, no, I didn't." The front door creaked behind him. He turned, flashlight jerking across the wall, just long enough to catch the shape of movement, a shoulder, a shadow disappearing through the frame. He ran, calling out, "Stop! Who's there?" By the time he reached the porch, the rain had turned heavy, erasing footprints, washing away sound. Only the faint smell of peppermint lingered, the same aftershave Daniel's hired actor had worn that day at the county office. He called 911. 2 patrol officers arrived 10 minutes later, wet and skeptical. They walked the rooms, checked the locks, shined their flashlights into corners he hadn't noticed before. "No forced entry," one said. "Maybe you left a door unlatched." George handed them the new document. "This wasn't here before. That marriage paper is gone." The officer read the heading and frowned. "Divorce certificate." "You sure this isn't part of your annulment case? I never filed that. I never signed that." The younger officer exchanged a look with the older one. "You live alone, sir?" "Yes. You ever misplace things?" "Forget appointments?" "I didn't forget my own name." The outburst hung in the room. The officers softened their tone. "We'll file a report," the older one said. "Just double-check with your lawyer in the morning." They left behind the smell of wet uniforms and disbelief. George sat back down at the table. The clock ticked indifferent. He laid the new document beside the lighter he kept for candles. The signature stared back, confident, fluid, his. The kind of handwriting that could convince anyone, even him. He walked to the mirror by the hallway. For a moment he didn't recognize the man staring back. The eyes were dull, the face slack with sleeplessness. "Maybe I did sign it," he muttered. "Maybe I forgot." He shook his head. No, the pen on the table was clean, unused. No ink on his fingers, no memory in his mind. But someone had been there, someone who knew what to take, what to leave, and how to make him doubt his own reflection. He turned off the light and sat in the dark, listening. The rain slowed to a whisper. The refrigerator hummed again, constant mechanical safe. Then a final sound from the hallway. Not a creak, a soft voice, faint, distorted, coming from somewhere near the phone. "Good night, sweetheart." He froze. It was his voice. The sound stopped as quickly as it came. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare turn on the light. "Maybe I didn't lose my mind," he said quietly. "Maybe someone took it." The house said nothing back. Only the rain starting again answered him. Night had a way of making silence feel alive. The house creaked like it remembered things he didn't want to. George sat at the kitchen table, the marriage certificate beside his elbow, the laptop screen casting a weak blue light over his hands. He pressed play. His voice filled the room, steady, calm, certain. "I, George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife." He stopped it after the second word. Every time he heard it, his chest tightened. It wasn't just that it was his voice, it was the confidence in it. He hadn't sounded that sure of anything since Mary died. He pressed play again, and again. The 8th time he didn't hear himself. He heard what was missing: the pause, the little stutter he always made before saying something personal. Mary used to tease him for it. He whispered, "Don't sign anything you don't read." It was her voice in his head, the message she'd left on his phone years ago when she handled the taxes, and he just trusted her to know. He could still hear her laugh right after that line, soft and certain. He missed that sound more than he missed peace. Rain started around midnight. It came slow at first, tapping the windows like small, polite knocks. By 1 a.m., it was pouring. The doorbell rang once, then again. George shuffled to the door, expecting maybe a neighbor, but there, soaked and shaking, was Daniel. The man looked smaller than his 45 years, eyes red, clothes clinging to his body like guilt. "Dad," he said, "please, just let me talk." George didn't move. "You shouldn't be here, I know. She said you'd call the cops. She's right. I deserve it." Daniel said, his voice cracking, "But I need to say this before I lose the chance." George hesitated, then stepped aside. Daniel entered like a man walking into church, slow, reverent, scared. He sat without asking. His hands trembled. "It was supposed to protect us." "That's what she said. The house, the bills, everything." George stared at him. "You watched her do it." Daniel nodded, tears spilling. "I was tired of failing you. I thought if I helped her fix it, maybe you'd see me as more than what? Than a mistake." The room went still. Only the rain filled the silence. George lowered his voice. "You didn't fail me, son." He leaned closer. "You betrayed me." Daniel flinched like he'd been hit. "She said she'd stop once the deed transferred. She said she'd undo it. She's not undoing anything. She's rewriting us." Daniel wiped his face. "She's moving the money tomorrow. Your accounts, the house title, everything. She has the logins." George felt the floor tilt beneath him. "She told me she deleted those." "She didn't. Then we stop her," George said. "Dad, I can't go back there. She'll know I talked to you. Then you already chose." Daniel stood. "I'm sorry. So am I." The next morning, George met Sarah at her office. She looked like she hadn't slept either. He placed a flash drive on her desk. "It's the voice file," he said. "There's something in it." Sarah plugged it in and played the clip. George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife." Then a faint whisper followed, almost lost under static. "Your son won't know." Sarah froze. The audio enhanced it, replayed the last 2 seconds. "That's her," George said. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "That's Melissa. It's spliced in. She didn't just fake your voice, she built a conversation. She left her own voice in there, which means," Sarah said, leaning back, "we can prove she created the recording." For the first time in weeks, George exhaled like someone who'd been holding his breath too long. The weight didn't vanish, but it shifted from despair to purpose. Will they believe it? "They'll have to," Sarah said. "Technology leaves fingerprints." He smiled faintly. "So do people." That evening, he sat again at the kitchen table. The rain had stopped. The clock ticked in its steady human rhythm. He stared at Mary's picture. "You were right," he murmured. "I should have read before I signed. I should have listened before I trusted." He picked up the recorder and whispered into it. "Trust isn't something you lose once. It disappears piece by piece until even your voice doesn't belong to you anymore." He stopped recording. He didn't play it back. He didn't need to hear his own voice to know it was still his. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, for the first time in months, so was he. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, the kind that had heard too many confessions and not enough apologies. George sat in the front row, his hands folded around the brim of his hat. Beside him, Sarah arranged folders in neat stacks, her pen clicking like a metronome for nerves. Melissa sat 3 rows away in a gray blazer, calm and composed. Daniel wasn't there. His lawyer was. Reporters whispered from the back, waiting for something to explode. The judge entered, robes sweeping like the sound of authority. Case number 2217, State of California versus Melissa Miller. The clerk began reading. Fraudulent identity filing, digital forgery, elder financial manipulation. Each charge sounded heavier than the one before it. Melissa didn't flinch. George didn't blink. Sarah stood first. "Your Honor, this case is not about a mistake. It's about the theft of identity, of trust, and of a man's life. The evidence will show a deliberate fabrication of marriage using cloned voice, forged signature, and impersonation." She nodded to the technician in the corner. The lights dimmed slightly as a screen flickered to life. A grainy video appeared, the county office fluorescent and dull. Two people stood before the clerk, Melissa in gray, and a man who looked exactly like George. The judge leaned forward. "Is that the video of the filing, yes, Your Honor?" Sarah stepped closer to the screen. "We asked the court to view this carefully." The man in the video smiled faintly as the clerk handed him a form. He signed it, smooth, confident. Then Melissa leaned in, said something we couldn't hear. The man nodded. Sarah paused the playback. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "is that you?" "No. Can you tell the court why you're certain?" "Because that's my face," George said, "but those aren't my hands." The room murmured. Sarah pressed play again. George leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Something tugged at him, a detail out of place. "Wait," he said. "Pause it." The technician froze the image. "Zoom in." George whispered, pointing to the neckline of the man's suit. The picture sharpened grain by grain until the collar filled the screen. Under the edge of synthetic skin, something peeled, faint, almost invisible. A seam. "Look at the neck," George said. "That's rubber." The room went silent. The judge adjusted his glasses. Zoom again. The image revealed it all, the thin lip of a silicone mask slightly lifted under the jaw. Someone in the back gasped. Sarah turned to the court. "Your Honor, this is not just identity fraud. It's impersonation using a physical disguise. This proves that the man in the video is not Mr. Miller." The DA stood. "Motion to authenticate with forensic analysis," granted, the judge said. Melissa's lawyer whispered to her, but she didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the screen, watching her own mistake unravel. Sarah clicked the next file, the audio. George's voice echoed through the courtroom. "I, George Miller, take Melissa Miller as my wife." Then the faint whisper underneath, "Your son won't know." That whisper, Sarah said, belongs to the defendant. It was spliced into the deepfake recording. The judge exhaled long and slow. "Proceed." Sarah closed her folder. "Your Honor, this evidence establishes deliberate fabrication. We request immediate annulment and criminal review." The judge nodded. "The court hereby nullifies the marriage certificate under fraudulent pretense. The record will be sealed and replaced with correctional notation." A rustle of relief swept the room, except for Melissa. She stood suddenly, hands trembling, voice breaking through tears. "I didn't do it to hurt him. I just wanted to keep the family together. You don't know what it's like to watch everything fall apart." Her voice cracked on family. The sound echoed, then died. George turned to her eyes, calm voice low. "Family doesn't mean control. It means care. And you forgot the difference." Melissa shook her head. "You think justice makes it better? It doesn't bring back what we lost." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Justice came, but family never did." She broke down crying. The bailiff guided her out gently, her footsteps fading down the hall. When it was over, Sarah gathered the papers. "It's done," she said. George didn't stand right away. He stared at the empty seat where Daniel should have been. "He couldn't face it," Sarah said softly. "Neither could I, once," George replied. He rose slowly, hat in hand, the old joints creaking like tired wood. Outside, the afternoon sun was too bright. The courthouse steps glowed white, the air heavy with heat. Reporters called his name, but he didn't answer. He looked up at the flag waving above the roofline, the same flag he'd saluted when he was 20. Then he looked back down the street toward the house that had once been his and now was again. "I won the case," he said under his breath, "but I lost the people." Sarah heard him, but she didn't answer. Some victories were too quiet to celebrate. He put on his hat and started walking. The courthouse days faded like old photographs. Names, papers, signatures, all filed and forgotten by people who never lived them. George's house was his again, but it didn't feel like home. The lawn grew wild. The mailbox stayed empty. Some nights he caught himself setting 2 plates on the table, then quietly putting one away. The news had already moved on. Some called him a victim. Others called him senile. Either way, they stopped calling. Daniel never showed up. Melissa was awaiting sentencing, her name buried under legal updates that no one read. For the first time in months, there were no reporters at his gate. Just silence. He thought that was peace. On a Friday evening, the sun bleeding low through the blinds, George turned on his old computer. Dozens of unread emails blinked in the corner of the screen. Utilities spam a newsletter about retirement planning. Then one message stood out. No sender, no subject, just a file icon, projectlegacy.zip. He hovered the mouse, frowning. Then, curiosity or maybe instinct made him click. Inside the folder were payment receipts, transfer logs, and one note: she wasn't the mastermind. Check the source. The sender had included routing numbers, encrypted dates, and a list of wire transfers made 6 months before the fake marriage. Every transfer came from one account. The name hit him like a door slamming shut. Thomas Miller, his half-brother. They hadn't spoken in 20 years, not since their father's will gave George the house and left Thomas with almost nothing. He remembered the last thing Thomas said: "If I can't get the house, I'll make sure no one does." He stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. The email had no reply address, no trace, only a whisper of a promise left behind in digital ink. He printed it anyway. That night, he sat by the window with the paper in his lap and a small lighter in his hand. He unfolded the marriage certificate, the one that had ruined his name, his family, his peace, and placed it beside the email printout. He struck the lighter. Flames crawled across the paper, curling the edges into black memory. The firelight danced over Mary's photo on the wall, and for a moment it almost looked like she was smiling. When the paper turned to ash, something small and metallic rolled across the table: his wedding ring, the real one, the one he'd stopped wearing the day he buried her. It hit the wood with a soft ting. He picked it up, turning it in the light. "I feared strangers would steal from me," he said quietly. "I never thought it'd be family." The fire burned itself out. Smoke drifted upward, thin as forgiveness. He looked back at the computer. The screen was still on. The cursor blinked again. One more message had arrived. Same sender, same empty subject line. He opened it. No text this time. Just an icon. A small paper clip that read, "Attachment 1." He didn't click. He didn't move. He just stared as the cursor pulsed, waiting, breathing, alive. But the message didn't end there, he said softly. It had an attachment. Silence, then fade to black. "And if you're still here, tell me, what would you do if your own voice turned against you? Would you fight to prove it wrong, or would you wonder how many people already believed the lie? If this story stayed with you, share it. Because someone somewhere is trusting a signature they haven't read and a voice that isn't theirs. This story isn't about marriage, it's about trust and what happens when it's signed away." Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay curious, and never stop questioning the things that sound too familiar.